Welcome to the second episode of the new mini-series here on Sfarim Chatter, Rav Kook, Life and Legacy. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode continues where we left off with the first episode, with Rav Kook arriving in then Palestine as the Rabbi of Yafo. And the episode ends when he returns as the Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem after being stuck in Europe for World War I, namely in Switzerland and England. This is the second episode of the series, with the first airing this past Sunday. And the final episode in the series will air on Thursday, with Rav Kook's yahrzeit being this Friday, September 6th, which is Gimel Elul. This mini-series is sponsored by Maggid Books, a division of Koren Jerusalem, who is the proud publisher of several works by Rav Kook, including a commentary on the Siddur compiled by Rabbi Betzal Naor, and the newly translated Hadarav in his inner chamber, a collection of Rav Kook's most intimate writings found in his personal notebooks from throughout his career. They've also published Rav Kook's work Orot in English, as well as a Hebrew-English edition, as well as a translation and commentary of Shabbat Aretz about Shemitah. Listeners of Sfarim Chatter can get 10% off all Koren and Maggid books with code Sfarim Chatter, SEFORIMCHATTER. Visit www.korenpub.com/Rav Kook today. That's KORENPUB.com/RAVKOOK. And including they have many Sidurim, Machzorim, and many other books. And you can use the code on that as well. To sponsor an episode of the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. You can find the link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Sfarim, new books, book deals, and other information. So you can subscribe. You can also subscribe and rate the podcast, and whether you listen on 24/6, Apple, or elsewhere. And also, finally, please let me know your thoughts on this Rav Kook series, as well as the miniseries idea, whether you like it or not. And with that, enjoy the episode of the miniseries. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and the second episode in the mini-series about Rav Kook, Rav Mirsky Kook. And I'll be joined once again by Professor Yehudah Mirsky. This time, in the last episode, we ended off with Rav Kook being elected the Chief Rabbi of Yafo and traveling to Eretz Yisrael. And now we're going to pick up with Rav Kook arriving there in 1904, and we're going to go through this episode will actually cover a shorter period of time, but it probably should be just as long or just as much information. We'll go through his being stuck in Europe through World War I, and we'll get to there and how that happened. So thank you, Professor Mirsky, for joining me once again.
Thank you, Nachi. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I really appreciate it.
So I think we said in the last episode, I don't think neither of us went and re-listened to it before this. We think we discussed how he got elected the Chief Rabbi of Yafo, but if not, you can recap that and talk and you know, his arrival in Eretz Yisrael in Yafo. Yafo today has been incorporated in Tel Aviv, which wasn't existing at the time. But we should discuss also what Yafo is, where Yafo is, and what was going on in Eretz Yisrael, which was then Palestine when Rav Kook arrived.
Yeah, so in Eretz Yisrael, we're talking 1904. World War I is 10 years away, and nobody knows it's about to happen, right? But people know that the Ottoman Empire, which is running that part of the world, is going through all kinds of changes. People are having questions, what are their identities? What are their national identities? And as always, like the European empires, France, England, etc., Russia, they're messing around in that part of the world, everybody trying to advance their interests. So like you said, there's no Tel Aviv then. Yafo, which is a port city, right? Ancient port, very old port city, is essentially, so to speak, the capital of what we call HaYishuv HaChadash, the new Yishuv, right? Sort of like by the turn of the 20th century, there is a substantial enough presence of non-traditional Jewish living in Eretz Yisrael, and also non-traditional, even people who are personally frum, but like Ashkenazi Jews who are working as farmers and working as laborers and doing that kind of thing, right? So we already have this division between the new Yishuv and the old Yishuv. And what's part of what makes Yafo of those days so fascinating, even today, it's just like it's a magnet for all these interesting idealistic characters, most idealistic, some not. Also, we have to remember most of the people who come to Eretz Yisrael during that time are running away from pogroms and poverty like everyone else. But there are these groups of people who are very committed to the Zionist idea, which is still developing. Nobody knows exactly what this thing Zionism is going to be. There's a character named a writer named Yoshua Radler Feldman, who was later known by his pen name as Rabbi Binyamin. Is a fascinating character. It's been recent scholarship on him in recent years, and he was this important left journalist, but he was also religious and was like a real bridge. Was somebody who was like a real bridge between the chalutzim, the pioneers, and the religious community. And in a memoir of his, he leaves, I'll just read it in English translation, but he leaves like a few line description of like what Yaffo was in those days, like around 1904, 1910. Yaffo, a small community, but very strange, all shuddering, boiling, bubbling, taut and ready, all kinds of parties and streams, directions and inclinations, wars among them, of words, of course. Everything is floating, changing, shifting form, and there's a rabbi, a genius, a rhetorician, and a bit of a poet, so different from the rabbis you've known or even appreciated in your life. Yet when it comes down to it, you can't really grasp him either. So that's the thing. So that's where we find Rav Kook. He's in this setting where there's all these people creating these like new societies, new communities, and they're sensing that he's a new kind of rabbi, and he's sensing that he's maybe going to become a new kind of rabbi. But it's all still very, very open, very unfinished.
So I think we discussed how he got elected. If you're trying to recap how he gets elected and how he gets to Yaffo at all.
Right. So he very briefly, he wasn't involved in Zionist politics or in the, the Mizrahi, the formal religious wing of the Zionist movement had been formed in 1902. He wasn't part of that. Earlier when you had Chovevei Tzion, he wasn't part of that. He was very much marching to his own drummer. But he had come to the attention, as I said, there were people who, a number of like the early sort of chalutzim were people who were what we would call today frum, right? And they're very much descendants of Aliyat Talmidei Hagra and so on, especially Yoel Moshe Solomon, one of the founders of the new city of Jerusalem and Petach Tikva. And they discovered this, and Yoel Moshe Solomon in particular discovered when he was like on some trip to Europe doing fundraising, this young Rav who was just remarkably interesting and thoughtful. We have this marvelous depiction of him. We may have mentioned it. Yitzhak Nissenboim was a prominent religious Zionist figure. When Rav Kook gets the job to be the Rav of Yaffo, he goes and visits him in Boisk, and he says, I'd never heard of this guy. He wasn't involved in Zionist. He hadn't published many books, but I spent a couple of days talking with him, and I was just amazed that he was this like big Talmud Chacham who was like a baki in like all the sides of Jewish learning, halacha, machshava, Tanakh, poetry, you name it, and even modern philosophy, and that he was working towards constructing some sort of new spiritual path. So people thought that this would be an appropriate spiritual leader for this new community taking shape in Yaffo, somebody who could be like responsive, but also profoundly traditional. So that's how he gets there. Also, his former father-in-law from his first marriage, his wife had died, but he was still very close to his former father-in-law, Rav Elio David Rabinowitz Te'omim, the Aderet, was at the time the number 2 Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem. He was the designated successor to the legendary Reb Shmuel Salant. So that was also part of how he got there.
So one thing that'll come up over this episode, there are a few controversies. And with Rav Kook, the first episode we didn't really discuss them, didn't come up, but there are going to be a number of controversies. And I think we should just jump into the first one right here because it comes up right away. So Rav Kook arrives, and shortly thereafter, Theodor Herzl dies. The founder, founding face of Zionism, and he dies. And as you said, Rav Kook wasn't involved in Zionism, but Rav Kook decided to get up and give a hesped, give a eulogy.
Yeah, he eulogizes him. Right. There's a bank there that's affiliated with the Zionist movement in Yaffo, and it's sort of, because also remember, there's no Tel Aviv yet, right? So there's this bank in Yaffo that's like a bank that's affiliated with with the Zionist movement, and they hold a memorial service for Herzl, and the rabbi, contrary to some people's expectations, shows up and he decides to give a eulogy. Now.
And to be clear, Herzl, besides for the Zionism part, he's someone that's not religious, nothing to do with religion.
Right, absolutely. Right. So the thing is, then he doesn't talk about Herzl the man. He doesn't mention him even once. So what does he talk about if he doesn't talk about the man Herzl? So he lays out, and I think we may have touched on it last time, he lays out what seems to be, he's developing a kind of philosophy of history. And he starts, and sort of also, as not infrequently happened with Rav Kook, you sort of wonder what his listeners were making of this as he was talking. But anyway, he gives this discourse about Mashiach ben Yosef, right? In Chazal, there's this figure, Mashiach ben Yosef, who is this somewhat obscure figure in rabbinic literature who is supposed to die, but in Mashiach ben Yosef's death, he makes way for Mashiach ben David. So already in Eastern Europe, Rav Kook in his notebooks had been writing that maybe the Zionist movement is something like Mashiach ben Yosef, something that prepares the way for the Geula, the fuller Geula later on. And now Mashiach ben Yosef died, which seems to be operating according to Chazal's But he says, but it's not just a political thing, because with him, it's never just a merely political thing. What's the principle of Mashiach ben Yosef? Because remember, we said last time, during Rav Kook's years in Eastern Europe, and it's also crucial throughout, we'll talk a lot about his political stances and place in society and institutional roles, etc., but they're very driven by his machshava and by his theological development. So he was very concerned between the relationship between the body and the soul and the mind, right? That's why he writes this book on Tefillah and Shalosh. He's very concerned about the relationship between like what Jews have in common with non-Jews and what Jews don't have in common, not just physically, but also morally, ethically. God is the God of all the world, but he's specifically the God of Israel. And so he develops this idea, and there's other Zionist thinkers like Ahad Ha'am who were playing with these ideas at the time, and he takes it in a certain direction that, you know, if the first stage of Jewish history was the Tanakh, which is like all about the body and the land, and like the Korbanot are very real, and also Jews have power and they engage in warfare and all of that, then like the Judaism of Galut, of exile, is disembodied, is spiritual, is highly ethical. The job of Mashiach ben Yosef is, so to speak, to restore the material foundation of the land of Israel so that the Torah of the Galut can return and create a new and fuller Judaism that unites body and soul. So this is rather far-reaching, and he elaborates it for the first time. It's also, for those, you know, if it sounds a little familiar, like from the philosophies of history of Hegel, dialect, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis is the embodied Judaism of the Bible. Antithesis is the disembodied Judaism of the Galut, and synthesis is the great redemption, the great exile. So he is seeing, even then, he's seeing the Zionist movement only marginally as like, yeah, this is like, because most of the religious Zionists of the time, the people, you know, who found the Mizrahi, they're interested in Zionism because it seems like a really good way to help Jewish social, economic, and political problems. With him, no, he sees like there's some, yes, that's true, of course, but there's some deeper spiritual current going on here, and there's something about the Jewish return to the land that can actually bring about a deeper meaning of Torah. And it's somewhat ambiguous, morally ambiguous. That he doesn't mention Theodor Herzl even once. Mitzad Echad, he doesn't mention Theodor Herzl even once, because then he gives himself credit. Like people say, "What? How could you eulogize this Shagitz? What? I didn't even mention him. I'm just giving covet to the man and his activities and the movement." But also, in a deep sense, he almost like doesn't need Theodor Herzl. Like Theodor Herzl, the man, the Viennese playwright who has an identity crisis and creates this political movement, he says halfway between a lunatic and a genius, is almost like is dissolved in like this larger historical drama that he thinks he's starting to see unfold before his eyes.
And Rav Kook notes to that Derek that he's going to get pushback. He knew this was something that was going to be controversial. What kind of pushback does he get?
There, he doesn't get a whole lot of pushback. Where he starts getting more is not long thereafter with regard to a different important figure of the Zionist revolution. That's Eliezer ben Yehudah, right?
Yeah, if you want to talk about Ben Yehudah here, you can just jump in.
Yeah, because that's when he doesn't get a whole lot of pushback there, but he does get, because it really starts with starting in a few months later, Eliezer ben Yehudah, who is he's the founder. He's not the, you know, we often talk about the revival of the Hebrew language. Hebrew never died, right? Anybody who learns Torah knows that there's like all kinds of scholarship and a lot more being written in Hebrew all the time, right? But Eliezer ben Yehudah is crucial. I mean, Hebrew gets revived as a sort of westernized literary language through people like Ahad Ha'am, who like figure out how to write essays. You know, and people try like Agnon figure out how to write novels. A lot of these guys are in Yaffo at the time also. Eliezer ben Yehudah is crucial, of course, for the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language. Now, Eliezer ben Yehudah, born Eliezer Perlman, had by this point been in Yerushalayim for decades, and he was a very difficult character. And he had this newspaper called Hatzvi. There's actually been a recent Israeli television series that's like a drama series about Eliezer ben Yehudah. It's very charming and interesting. And he's a strong nationalist, and obviously he's like a fanatic. You know, he famously, Eliezer ben Yehudah, he doesn't let anybody speak a language in his house that's not Hebrew. He forces, even though they can barely, he makes everybody break their teeth on it. He doesn't let his kids hear languages that aren't Hebrew. But at the time, the Zionist movement is also toying with the idea of what was called the Uganda Plan, right? The British say, well, you know, Palestine might not work out, but we have some land in like Kenya or Uganda that we can give to you in East Africa that we can give to the Jews for colonization. And there's some people who say this is a good idea. Even the Mizrahi Some of them are in favor of it because, again, they're not invested in building the Beit HaMikdash here. They're invested in like finding a place for Jews to find refuge. And interestingly, one of the people who comes out in favor of this is Eliezer ben Yehudah, because he's interested in the Jews finding a place of refuge, and also there's something about like the non-traditionalism that appeals to him. So he writes an article and he says, people say that, we in the Uganda plan, that we adherents to the Uganda plan are turning our back on tradition. You know what? We are turning our back in tradition. And l'chatchila we're turning our back in tradition. Tradition should have our backs turned to it. So this makes a stir. So then Rav Kook writes an open letter to him. And basically to him and to his readers, right? Saying, listen, don't talk about yourselves that way. I know you think of yourself as a secular person, but like you're doing great things for the Jewish people. And especially your loyal readers should see themselves as people who in their own way are continuing Jewish history, albeit in unexpected directions. Sure. So then the Rabbanim from Yerushalayim write an open letter to Rav Kook out of a bit of collegial respect. They don't mention him by name. And they say, look you're new here. We've been dealing with this Ben Yehudah guy for decades. He's really, you don't know like what a bad seed this person is and how terrible he is. So we'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you're like being lamitz chus on him and his people because you don't really know them. But chachamim yizaru b'divreichem. So that's like the first like wisp or the first marker that that there's some difference of approach here between him and the rabbis of Jerusalem.
Who, when we say the rabbis of Jerusalem in the old Yishuv, we're talking about Rosh Salant, then Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who ends up taking over.
Right. Rishulek Diskin. Yeah.
Derek was
and
there.
Salant himself was a very conciliatory personality by and large, but his successor is less so. And Rav Kook's father-in-law, the Aderet, passes away, predeceases Shmuel Salant, so he never succeeds him.
Right, and Shmuel Salant passes away in 1909, I believe, and then Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld takes over. Right, exactly. Right. We'll get to the trip that Rav Kook takes Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld through the country. That's important, I think, to talk about. We'll get to
that.
Rav Kook, something interesting that I see quoted in your book that I can read is that you say that Rav Kook, when he gets there, he travels around to Rishon LeZion, Rehovot, and the surrounding areas, and he's surprised. He sees that farmers are sympathetic to religion, and he's like, it's classic Rav Kook style. He passes through the fields, and he says, "Look, a Jewish cow." And he says one time, he says, "I could kiss every stone in this land, even the mules on the way." And he gets very excited. I mean, is this his first experience with what's going on in Eretz Yisrael? And this is kind of outpouring of emotion.
He had never visited before. And he's never visited before, and he wasn't really part of this before, right? I mean, we know from an early age he's a very deeply feeling person, He's a very deeply feeling person, and like profound capacities for. But not only that, there's something in his journals, in his first journal that he writes in the first journal of his that we have from when he comes to Yaffo. He has a line there where he says, like, Baruch Hashem, God made me as the sort of person who is able to encompass a lot and speak to a lot of people and reach out to a lot of people. And now that I'm here in Eretz Yisrael, I kind of want to let everything pass through me. And in a sense, there's like a Kabbalistic idea there because of like, and this is something we'll talk about more, but crucial for him. In the Kabbalah, Eretz Yisrael is sort of in deep sense identified with, obviously with Knesset Yisrael, with Torah Shebaal Peh, and also the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah, right, the Shekhinah is like less like Migar Meklum. The Shekhinah is sort of that which gathers in all the spiritual energies, from all over the place and like brings them down and then brings them up and so forth. So his thoughts is always are on multiple levels. There's like the day-to-day, and also just one thing we'll talk about it again, but when he's in Yaffo, I mean, we'll talk about the controversies in the books and the theology. He's also tachlis extremely busy because he is now he's charged with running a community and also building communal institutions, right? Building shuls and mikvahs and supervising shchitas. And he spends an incredible amount of time, finding money for gemachs and negotiating between like balabatim and city councils and this and that. So he's not in a cloister. at the same time so there's, you have this like this life of practice and this life of thinking happening simultaneously.
Right, which is important. I mean, he is a communal rabbi in this community. As you meant, you read the description of what's going on there, and there's all sorts of people that are in Yafo at the time. I mean, it's got from every angle. And so, what's that like?
Like one of the stories I love is like there was a certain, I guess what we would call Batei Boshet. There were houses of ill repute in Yafo. And when he tried to crack down on them, because he was very open-minded and because he was like very friendly to the young chalutzim, so the local soccer club made clear, because like when the owners of these places, of these houses of ill repute, didn't appreciate the rabbi trying to shut them down, so the football club got together and defended him. So in addition to being just like a picanti story, it's also a sense of like the relationships he was starting to develop with people.
Yeah, he was already an interesting and unique personality at the time. And so what was his relationship like? Who, I think this is where he meets Yaakov Moshe Chalap. He starts some of his Talmid, one of his first Talmidim, and who else is he interacting with at the time? Because there's interesting people, and he's not your regular classic.
So first off, a few years later in Yafo, he actually creates a yeshiva, which in some respects is the closest he ever came to realizing his full educational agenda. Because, I mean, the yeshiva became Yeshiva Merkaz Harav. The yeshiva founds in Jerusalem in the 1920s, and it's still here, and it's very important. Yeshiva Merkaz Harav is sort of it's a different iteration of what he's trying to do. B'kitzur, in Yafo, he manages to create a small yeshiva where he has like the Talmidim are like all mitzuyanim. They're like handpicked to be like really excellent students. And in addition to like a thorough, curriculum in, Gemara, Halacha, etc., they're also doing Machshavet Yisrael, and they're also studying Jewish philosophy, and he's having them learn Tanakh Be'iyun, and he's having them also learn how to write good Hebrew. There's still scholarship to be done on this. One of the theories that there's somebody who becomes well known, but he's still like wreathed in mystery today, somebody known as Mr. Shoshani, who was the legendary teacher of Elie Wiesel and of Emmanuel Levinas, the important philosopher after World War II. And there's, and there are any number of people, including me, who think that actually that his real name was Hillel Perlman, and that he was one of Rav Kook's students in Yafo. So he gathers these very interesting people around. But more to the point, a lot of the people he's interacting with in Yafo are writers. So, for instance, Shmuel Yosef Chachkis, who becomes Shmuel Yosef Agnon, grows very close to Rav Kook. There's an important figure named Azar, Alexander Ziskin Rabinovich, who is a traditionalist maskil and a disciple of Achad Ha'am and cultural Zionism. He comes in Aliyah, and he's a bit older, but he's very much a bridging figure between Rav Kook and these younger writers. And he's introducing Rav Kook to these younger writers, and he's talking to them a lot. And there's Rabbanim who he's talking to, and there's some Rabbanim who are interested in what he's doing. There are Rabbanim who don't really understand what he's trying to do. And then there are, and so he's also in Yafo, he starts interacting with Sephardi Jews, right? And at some point, somebody who's working like a younger Sephardic rabbi, sort of like working under him, is none other than Harav Uziel, who eventually becomes the Rishon LeZion and an outstanding figure. But the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim, of course, are keeping an eye on him. And when things first start to, already by 1906 or so, they're starting to notice that he's different. A few things happen in 1906. In 1906, he publishes two small books, one called Eider Yakar, which is framed as a eulogy for his late father-in-law, the Aderet, where he lays out a lot of his broad ideas about how the rabbis ought to be engaging younger people and dealing with literature and philosophy. And he publishes a small, powerful book of essays called Ikvei Hatzon. And Ikvei Hatzon, Tzilach B'Ikvei Hatzon, Riyad Gideotayach HaMashkenot HaRo'im. And, he quotes a Chazal that the Navi, the Manhigim are supposed to see where the flock is going. And that's where he publishes these really interesting articles, an article called Hador, the generation or the time, where he argues that for the first time, it's where he lays out in public saying these young people who are rebelling against halacha in the way that they're doing it, this is different than like Ovrei Avera of the past. They're highly principled. They're highly motivated. They're very idealistic. They're very self-sacrificing. They're doing this for Klal Yisrael and the Jews, and we need to think about this differently, right? And he has a few very important essays in there about hapachad, right? How, like, the thing that will stand in the way of developing Yiras Shamayim is people being scared of things, and of course we have to like have faith and like not be scared. So he's starting to develop these open ideas, and when halachically the question starts to be joined, is first in a controversy over a seemingly not terribly important issue, and that's Mekitnius, right? Pesach 1906, he gives a heter for there's a sesame oil factory in Yafo. And he says that he rules that their products are kosher for Pesach because as Mekitniot go, this is fine. So Kitniot is, of course, a much discussed issue. And over the centuries, for all the obvious reasons, the Isser and Kitniot becomes like sort of a touchstone for a nodal point of where halacha seems to be flexible or not flexible or what have you. So there's several Batei Din in Yerushalayim, and one, the Hasidic Beit Din in Yerushalayim, writes him a letter saying that we understand that you've given a heter for sesame oil here on Pesach, and this is terrible, and we're against it. And there ensues a lengthy correspondence. Now, there's the halachic issues that are involved, and on the halachic issues, again, Mekitnius is such like it's not that hard to imagine a competent posek deciding that certain forms of Mekitniot are mutter on Pesach, right? What really starts emerging are two salient issues in this correspondence that he has with these Rabbanim in Yerushalayim. The first is what is the authority of a Beis Din in one city to regulate the authority of a Beis Din in another, right? In some ways, and one of his arguments is, I'm not telling you all how to paskin in Yerushalayim. I'm the posek here. What's going on? And then very deliberately, but the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim, they're not dumb, right? They see that he's being they sense that with him there's like a lechatchila kind of accommodation to the people around him and to the secular people around him that they find very disturbing. And at one point he joins the issue very explicitly. He says, look it, when the Chassam Sofer said Chodesh Asur min HaTorah, it was the right thing to say, but these weren't the kind of people he was talking about. When the Chassam Sofer says Chodesh Asur min HaTorah, it's because like everything is falling apart and people are abandoning and going to reform and this and that, and that's not who we're talking about here. And with these people, especially these young people here, if we take that kind of approach, all we're going to do is alienate them even more. So they need to be able to see that halacha can like be flexible when appropriate, and sort of and be mechil. Today we would say be inclusive of them, right? So that's his argument with them there. And that argument is small potatoes, or sort of a rehearsal for a big argument that happens a couple years later.
So before you get to the next argument,
yeah.
So anyone who wants to read more about this, that's my controversy. It's in Aruch Mishpat. There's a few I see here.
That's
right. It's all in the middle, in the middle of Hilchas Pesach and Aruch Mishpat, which is his letter, his letters on Aruch Chaim. So he's writing to Yerushalayim to Rav David. Do you know who he's writing to?
I'm not sure.
He just says, Chaviv Rava Goin Ral David Shlita. Not sure who he's writing to, so we'll have to.
I need to check that up.
Someone will write it right away. Someone will write it right away. Oh, he's writing to so and so. It also says Mayral, the first one's length. So I don't know. Anyway, there's a bunch of chuvas you can read. Lengthy. Anyone who wants to read more about this, that's my old controversy that he was being matter and they weren't.
And also, this is maybe a good place that if we look at his books of chuvas, and of course, there's multiple books of chuvas. Most of them are like not remotely connected to like highly fraught ideological questions, etc. They're like plain old childless and Havayis Dabai Varava and all that kind of thing. Even though, of course, a number of them are about these larger issues, and he has his own methods of dealing with things.
Okay, guys. Yes, you were getting to another controversy.
Yeah, the big one, the Shemitah. So already, as we start having this. People were already noticing by the 1880s that we're starting to have Jewish agriculture in the land of Israel. Of course, there had been the Sephardic communities in the land of Israel, in Eretz Yisrael. They were there for a very, very long time. They weren't doing agriculture. Like, they were urban. They were in the cities. They were in trades, merchants, etc. So now you're starting to have Jewish agriculture. And so what are you going to do with Shemitah? Right? What are you going to do with Shemitah? So already in the 1880s, the suggestion had been made of selling Jewish-owned land to non-Jews for Shemitah, so that you could then work the land during Shavuos. And the halachic argument has several constituent parts. One is you have to argue the extent to which Shemitah B'zman says D'Rabbanan, and what a kinyan on land in Eretz Yisrael can be mafkia and not mafkia. And there's also a question of selling land to a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael because of los chanem, and we can get to those things. So there's a halachic argument, but of course the hashkafic arguments are there from the beginning. So early on, Rabbi Yitzchak Kochanan thinks this is a good idea, because also we're not talking about nowadays we're used to heter mechira, which is selling everything to everyone to some. We're actually talking about specific identifiable plots of land that you're selling to some identifiable non-Jew who you know. Even though Rav Kook's Rebbe, the Netziv, is opposed to this, actually because of he himself is sympathetic to Chibat Zion and Proto-Zionism, and likes the idea of the burgeoning Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael being some sort of prelude to something that looks like redemption. At any rate, Rav Kook decides to give his authority behind Heter Mechira, and he writes a small book about it. It's a book called Shabbat Haaretz. Most of Shabbat Haaretz is just a line-by-line commentary and annotations to Rambam Hilchos Shemitah. By all accounts, he wrote it it took him about a week to do it. But importantly, there's also a lengthy introduction to Shabbat Haaretz. There's two introductions. There's the halachic introduction, right, where he goes through the conceptual questions that I mentioned earlier about, the status of Shemitah B'zman says D'Rabbanan D'Oraisa, what kind of kinyan can be mafkia on what kind of isurim. Also the question of los chanem, where interestingly he argues that for purposes such as this, Muslims are not considered non-Jews for purposes of los chanem. Because also we know generally, Rav Kook, and he writes in his correspondence, often and theologically at times he's very hard and fast distinction between Jews and non-Jews. Halachically, in some other ways, he regularly is willing to go with the Meiri, that, people who are essentially moral idolaters, moral monotheists, don't have the status of Lodei Avodah Zarah at any rate. But also in the preamble or the preface to Shabbat Haaretz, he also lays out a philosophy of history. And the philosophy of history as it applies to halacha, and essentially that this is a time of transition for this is a time of transition for the Jewish people, where we have to keep in sight the ideals before us and the ideals of Geula, and recognize we're not there, but we're not totally as far from there as we used to be. So this is a time when we have to a sort of a liminal space in history, an in-between time in history where we have to show certain kinds of flexibility while holding the line elsewhere, while keeping our ultimate goals in sight. So it's a rather subtle and complex position. And here people began to really get upset, right? Because it seems that, okay, this is not just that this rabbi, this is a guy who likes learning machshava, fine. It's not just that he's very nice and very musardik and very nechaviv to everybody, fine. And it's not even that he wants to be mekil for some factory in Yafo, fine. Here, there's something that's looking like a philosophy of halacha that's incorporating elements of dynamism and change for the sake of what he thinks is the historical process that he's living through. And you can understand why for some people that's a very destabilizing and disturbing point of view. Now, interestingly, when Rav Kook, what people don't realize, a lot of the negotiation or the balancing that Rav Kook is doing isn't just vis-a-vis the people, so to speak, to his halachic right, but also people to his left. For instance, right, a number of these moshavot, these settlements, these colonies are being funded by the Rothschilds. and by Baron Rothschild, and they are administered through these clerks and people working for Baron Rothschild. So as soon as he says Heter Mechira is fine, they all start saying, "Okay, folks, everybody's back to work," including doing the oraisas, and there's no kulas, and also Rav Kook Beferish says, I'm only giving this heter for people who feel they really want to do it. But of course, people who don't want to do this heter, tavo alehem bracha, and I mechazik them. And he was raising money in order to support farmers who didn't want to use this heter. But the barons people say, okay, everybody, back to work, back to work. The rabbi says you have to work, so he has to be fighting with them at the same time. So he's in this difficult position of trying to again, he's sort of trying to stake out this position vis-a-vis both. And it's like neither, in Yerushalayim, they're seeing him as some kind of kofar. And here, and that's one thing he has to avoid. And another is people like Baron Rothschild's man seeing as, okay, here's this pliable rabbi who's like a puppet and he'll do whatever we want. And he has to be very takif to show that he's not that either.
I mean, this is what happened. It seems like, and we're going to get in episode 3, for the listener, we're going to get in episode 3 to his legacy and his impact. We'll get to how he's perceived today by different sides. But at the time, I mean, he's essentially in like no man's land a lot. He's on both sides. He's this middle figure, which ends up being pulled in both ways. And of course, it's controversial. Of course, from one end, but on the other end, also they're like, oh, he's too yeshivish, whatever word you want to use today.
Also, they've never seen it. Like in that thing I wrote a few minutes ago. They've never seen someone like this before. Right? He's super frum. He didn't go to he looks and like lives like what today we call a Haredi Jew, right? He's like learning
but he's a free thinker and he's got these different
in some respects he's like
regular.
Well, that's like
he's a rabbi.
It's like he's wearing tefillin all day. Right? Like he wears tefillin all day and he's like, doing tikkun chatzos every night. And he's, doing all this stuff while he's also like having these far-reaching philosophical thoughts. And also what's interesting is, especially in the Jerusalem years, like some of the local intellectuals, the local philosophers begin to start noticing, hey, this rabbi is actually, he's like mamash a philosopher. Like we ought to be reading him in university, right? So it's really quite a thing. By the way, an important feature of his thought in Yafo is that it's also he grows up, as far as Hasidus goes, he grows up knowing about Chabad, and there's always elements of Chabad in his writing from the beginning, but he starts learning about other forms of Hasidus in when he's in Yafo, not least Breslov. And he begins, he takes the idea, it's very interesting, there's this wonderful, his son, Rav Yehudah, he's not a Rav Yehudah, he's just Yehudah. He's learning in Yerushalayim and he's discovering Breslov and he's writing to his father about it. And his father's saying, wait a second, hold on, Yingel. Breslov is like very big and important. It's like very deep stuff, but you can't dive into it unless you have proper psychological hygiene and stuff, he says to him. And at the same time, he himself is starting to learn Breslov and especially the doctrine of the tzaddik. Because if in Reb Nachman, remember like in Reb Nachman, the tzaddik is somebody who like descends into the field of apikorsim and like try to lift their nitzotzes and try to bring there. And Rav Kook is not a Breslover, and there's like directions that Breslov goes in that he never goes to. But his idea of the Hasidic tzaddik, he begins to think that the tzaddik hador is like matzadik hador, that maybe the function, what the job of a tzaddik in his time and place is to look at all the people around them and try to figure out what are their good intentions or what are they trying to do and how you can because ultimately he wants to be Mekarav them to Torah, right? But also he thinks that they have what to contribute to a revitalized Torah. So, but yeah, and also this is also very strikingly in the Shemitah controversy is when the attacks start to get very personal. The attacks start to get very personal, and he starts getting denounced in Pashkevilim, and the Ridbaz, or Yaakov David Volkovsky, is an important rabbinic figure who went from Lithuania to Chicago and then came to Eretz Yisrael and became a fierce critic, a ferocious critic of Rav Kook around the Shemitah issues, and it accused him of perhaps having been bribed by the Rothschilds or by whomever, by the Zionists. And engages in very vociferous polemics with him that go on for several years after the Shemitah year. And what's striking is that this is when we also, we'd start to see more, but by now you're really starting to see this pattern of Rav Kook of absorbing powerful personal attacks against himself and never responding in kind. And like always saying my opponents are operating l'shem shamayim, and like he's really trying to, live like the Chazal idea of hanelavim ve'inam olvim, and to not be angry and kind. And that becomes, especially in Yerushalayim, here's a central drama of his life.
So you're saying, so he never lashes out, so to speak, at any of his opponents who attack him?
I don't know. He knows how to be angry. He knows how to be upset, right? There's things like Chil Shemayim B'far Hestia, Chil Shabbos B'far Hestia that he knows how to be very angry about, right? It's not that the man's never angry. But in these kinds of things, and especially when the attacks are about him, he tries very, very hard, never, like we say, Lashib B'To Matbea. Right? He tries also, I've seen, during when I sat in Rav Kook's archives, he's writing letters of recommendation for people who were critics of him. Because of the positions that he occupied in Yafa and later in Yerushalayim, he was a letter of recommendation from him was very important for getting an immigration certificate, for getting a job, for raising stucca for a gamach. And he's regularly writing letters on behalf of people who are critical of him elsewhere, because he's trying very, very hard to keep it l'shem shamayim. And it's difficult. We know personally, especially, we could talk about it more in the Yerushalayim years, is when this stuff really gets out of hand. We know that it hurt him personally. We know that he's very upset by this, but he tries very, very hard to not to respond in kind. Also, because also crucially, and this is actually an important lesson for today, in all of Rav Kook's writings, I've never seen him say that he hates anything except once, where he says that he hates anger. And in particular, he says, whenever you see a group that all they is, or he says, like, anger is, sometimes it's justified. But if you ever see a group that's angry all the time, and that all they are is angry, it's because they have no internal tochen. They have nothing constructive to offer. And so it pours out in anger. This is it's in the Yapo years that he writes these famous lines where he says, like, tzadikim atorim, like the pure tzadikim, they don't decry evil, they add good. They don't decry kfira, they add emuna. So that's the way he's trying to frame things.
So just to go back to the Shemitah controversy, so first of all, anyone interested, it's still available through Masada of Kook. It's one volume with two Tvarim. It's Shabbat Haaretz, and Eitz Hadar. So Eitz Hadar we didn't mention. We can go there for a second. Eitz Hadar is a book he writes, a sefer he writes about a Esrogim that you should get Esrogim rights to. At that time, I think they were still getting
Esrogim. And it's also because there were chashos that they were Morkov, and he's arguing that they're not Morkov. And it's not an earth-shattering book. But what's interesting, just you see the beginning. It's a very straightforwardly halachically argued book. What's interesting, you see the importance of the lavush for him. There's occasional machshava pieces that he puts in, but it's a very straightforward halachic treatise, Eitz Hadar, right? By the way, also for English readers, and even not only, Rabbi Yedidia Sinclair a few years ago did an English translation of the introduction to Shabbat Haaretz, and it was published by Koren, and he did a beautiful job. And also his own introduction to this introduction is a magnificent essay, on Rav Kook in general. Yeah, so Rabbi Yedidia Sinclair.
I'll include that in the show's notes. Also, when you say the importance of the lavush for Rav Kook, you mean the lavush, the halachic sefer, the lavush.
Yeah. The halacha also, because he was like a descendant of the lavush and took pride in that. But also, it's not surprising that Rav Kook is interested in the lavush, because lavush, has machshava points integrated into his halachic presentations. Rav Kook is always very interested in that.
So one final note on the Shemitah controversy, because
Sure.
I wouldn't say it's a contentious issue today. I think today there's, the battle lines have been drawn. There are those that do heter mechira and those that don't. But heter mechira today, those that are matrid really come from Rav Kook. But as you were kind of alluding to before, it's not so clear what his opinion would be, how they do heter mechira today.
It's first off, it's like everything else with Rav Kook. Who knows what he would say if he were here today. And then, presume when he was writing, he wasn't necessarily envisioning this massive wholesale thing. On the other hand, he didn't envision this massive whole-scale, agricultural venture. Also, he certainly didn't envision a rabbanut that's founded by him whose rabbis like sign on the Heter Mechira but won't eat from it, right? I mean, that is something, and presumably he would not, Rav Kook, he was not, one thing you could say about the man is that he was never Echad B'Pev Echad B'Lev, so yeah, that's like many things that he presumably could never have imagined. And yeah, the question of what Shemitah means today, it's a large and important question. And I think he's very clear that he doesn't mean to say, okay, Shemitah's gone away and now you never need to worry about it anymore, right? Even his heter is very circumscribed. And of course, this is maybe an occasion to add that nowadays, in recent years, there's all these very interesting efforts that people are having to talk about bringing back the idea of Shemitah, not just Shemitah halachically, but Shemitah as a concept, right? Like as a pause in technological society, which is also things that he talks about, right? And Shemitah's Ksafim is an important like social justice idea, all these kinds of things. But yeah.
So let's focus some more on Rav Kook and his relationship with the old Yishuv and with the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim at the time. And this is very important, and it will continue to be important, especially in episode 3, where he when he becomes the Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem.
Because also his chief interlocutors in these years, I mean, he's on the screen of the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim. He's starting to talk to them and that. But what's so powerful for him is the encounter with the people of the second Aliyah, right? The encounter with the pioneers, with the poets, with the people who were like building, and like after 1909, the people who are actually building Tel Aviv and trying to build a Jewish city and trying to create all these institutions. And also he's struck by by the energies of it and the creative energies of it. And also he's struck by this is a time of tremendous cultural creativity, right? All these Hebrew literary journals and so on. And he's starting to encourage his Talmidim and his followers to start doing literary journals of their own. And he founds a few that will be more explicitly, for lack of a better word, religious, right? But while exploring the same questions of like justice and national identity and aesthetics, etc., but from a religious point of view.
So with the old Yishuv, the Rabbanim in the old Yishuv, what's his relationship like? And then that's a lead up to his trip that I alluded to earlier, 1913.
Right, because also, he's developing relations with them, and again, it's like he's from where they're from. Okay, it's not in the case of Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, he's not from Hungary, right? But he is like Basar Mibsara of the Lithuanian rabbinic elite, right? He's like the Talmud Muvhak of the Netziv. He is the Aderet's son-in-law. He's very much, and he learned Kabbalah with the Leshem, right? So he's very much of that world. And yet, and again, but he's different. So the relations are respectful, and you start seeing like people who will talk to him, like Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, they start seeing that like when you talk to the guy, you can't miss that, he's a big Talmud Chacham, right? You can't miss that Rav Kook is a big Talmud Chacham. You can't miss like the personal tzidkus, right? And you start, so like the at this point, there's one of the sort of like the patterns, the tfusim of, for lack of a better word, Haredi rabbinic attitudes towards Rav Kook is like tremendous respect, personal respect for the man, and a genuine distancing of oneself from his point of view. And during the Jerusalem years, that's going to come out often very, very sharply.
So you mentioned the Leshem just before you get to the trip. You mentioned the Leshem Shlomo Elyashiv, the noted Makubal from Lithuania, right, who Rav Kook had a relationship with. He was very close friends with him, and that's really also it should be noted. Rabbi Shlomo Elyashiv, the famous Pesach Hadar, Rabbi Elyashiv, Rav Kook was his Masada Kedushin. He used to go to Rav Kook. He used to be there for the I think even for the Shalosh Hodesh. He would go for the Shmuz and he'd write some of them down. We have some of his notes after Shabbos. So he was
with all these Jerusalem stories, in the Jerusalem stories, there's a lot of like stories about like all the Reb Shlomo Zalman, Reb Zalman Meltzer, Reb Tikachinsky was like at his bedside. Reb Zalman Meltzer, Reb Tikachinsky were at his bedside when he died. I mean, we'll talk about this. By the way, one thing that's really interesting, though, is also in terms of like these writers. So Rav Kook is fascinated. Like there's this famous writer, Yosef Chaim Brenner. And Yosef Chaim Brenner is like the secular saint of the second Aliyah, right? When Hillel Zeitlin, when he's killed in 1921 by Arab riots, and Hillel Zeitlin describes Yosef Chaim Brenner as Ha'ish shelo bikesh la'atzmo klum, right? This is a guy who was like this tortured secular saint, totally gave himself up to like to the Zionist revolution, the revival of the Hebrew language, like searingly critical of everyone and everything. Brenner is a magnificent writer, very important literary figure, says stuff that's like total kfira, but says, and also like logically the Jewish people have no way to survive, but still we have to persist and survive. And the only things that Brenner believes in are the Hebrew language and helping the poor, the Jewish poor, the workers. So Rav Kook is fascinated by him. And, Brenner is friendly with Agnon and friendly with these other guys. And Rav Kook is trying to like bring him into this circle of writers who he's talking to and who he's engaging with. And Brenner won't have it. And this is where it's really interesting because he, like Rav Kook, writes these things that are clearly about Brenner. And Brenner will write these caustic reviews that are like alluding to all kinds of svarim that sort of demonstrate Brenner's own many years of learning in yeshiva, right? But saying, Rabbi, I'm not part of your sacred revolution. Get over it. I don't want to be part of it. I'm in rebellion against you because I'm rebelling against you. Let's not make any mistake about that. And that's a very fascinating and sometimes ambiguous dynamic. And this is maybe a nice time to talk about the famous trip he took with Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld.
Yes.
So in 1913, right, in the fall of 1913, he has an idea to do something that will sort of ease some of these tensions between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv and him and some of the other Rabbanim. And so he had basically, they put together a group of 10 Rabbanim with Rav Kook, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rav Kook's a young rabbi who's becoming very close to Rav Kook, become very prominent later, Rav Yankiv Moshe Charlap. Rav Ben Sion Yadler, who was a respected rabbi from Jerusalem, who would be close to Rav Kook, and some other rabbis and so on. And they decide to go north. They decide to go to the Galil, and they decide to visit the cities and the settlements there. So when they go to Tveria, they go to Haifa, they go to Tzfat. They're very nicely received by the traditional communities. You have the older agricultural colonies there, like Zichron Yaakov and Chadera, and they're received very respectfully. And wherever they go, they talk and they give shiurim, and they see like they ask people what's going on with their local institutions, and they encourage them to to build a mikvah, to build a shul, and all that sort of thing, right? And strikingly, at several occasions, like in a place called Merchavia, they visit one place, and these are tiny places at the time, called Merchavia, which is near Haifa, and they conduct a memorial service for several workers who had been killed by local Arabs. One of the workers was killed while bringing medicine to a friend of his named Shmuel Dayan, who was the father of Moshe Dayan. And because the guy who was killed was named Moshe, so that's why Shmuel Dayan named his son Moshe. A reminder that it's a very small country with all sorts of interconnections between people, right? And this is interesting because these Rabbanim are trying to eulogize people who are kofrim, right? Who are sinners. So Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, he gives a eulogy based on Yadenu lo shafchu es adam hazeh v'leinenu lo ra'u, sort of sounding very traditional old Yishuv tones of violence is very far from the Jewish people, and so we mourn these dead because we're not the sorts of people who go around killing other people. And Rav Kook, by now he's sort of always trying to have it both ways, or open about his ambivalences. He expresses on the one hand his discomfort at eulogizing people who are, porkei ol. But on the other hand, he says that he wants to honor them because they're the heroic fallen. And some of the chalutzim don't take this well. and they start protesting and they get very upset with him. So you see, like, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld is in a very familiar stance as, like, a traditionalist response to these things. Rav Kook has this, he's trying to figure his way to something else. Then a famous incident they have at a place called Poriya, which is also in the news these days, Nebuch, because they get shelled sometimes. And there were some very dramatic events while they happened there. Some Arabs tried to steal some sheep. There were shots exchanged. Afterwards, Bekitzer, they spent somehow the ice broke. And Rav Kook and Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and the other Rabbanim, they spend the whole night, it's like they spend the night sitting around the fire with the chalutzim, and they're singing and they're dancing. And Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld is like in Shashel Chesed, and he's just like telling them stories about life in Jerusalem, and they're like deeply enjoying one another's company. Then also Rav Kook dances. Rav Kook even like dresses like one of the chalutzim. He puts on like a cloak and a headdress, and he rides horses with them, and he's dancing and singing with them, and at the end, please, he begs them, please start keeping Shabbos. Right. And what's interesting is was this trip successful or not? They got some successes in terms of some places did start opening shuls and have mikvahs and this and that. It exists in memory as this time when like old yeshuv, it took on a life of itself as like this Masah Rabbanim, as the old yeshuv and the new yeshuv trying to work together. And what is interesting is that you hear is the way it lived on in some like in the chalutz and the secular memory is, like something you'll regularly hear sometimes even from old kibbutznikim today. Well, Rav Kook was different. He used to come and he used to talk to us and he used to sit with us and so on and so forth. So, and I think, from an historical perspective, both Rav Kook and what he's representing, what he's trying to build, Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, what he's representing, trying to preserve, and also what he needs to build in order to preserve things, and the people of the new Yishuv, they're all doing this for the first time. Like they're all, like we look at it today and we can easily slot. Okay, so he's working like a Mizrachnik, and he's working like a Haredi, and he's working like some Chiloni guy, and but these categories didn't exist at the time because they're emerging out of these people's lived experiences, and none of them know that World War I is coming and about to scramble their world.
Well, and the Cooks don't either know. So Rav Kook is
right.
a little bit later than after this. His wife isn't well. The doctor says they should get away, and he's invited to the Yehudah. Yehudah's in Germany, and he goes to Germany. The Cooks get an invitation to go to the Yehudah's having a conference, and they decide to go. And they arrive in is it June or July of
July or 19. They arrive with exquisitely bad timing.
Yeah, the timing is like
the timing is terrible, right? So he decides. Right, his wife needs medical treatment. He could use a little bit. He's been in Eretz Yisrael for a decade. He's like very energized by everything that he's seen, everything he's learned, and also the Agudah is only founded 2 years earlier, in 1912, right? Yeah. So Agudah is this new organization, and it's finding its way towards things, and he wants to go there because, like, again, these are his people. Right? These are his people. And he wants to talk to them and share with them his observations and what he thinks he's learned and try to, as always, do this bridge building. So they go to Europe and then boom, World War I starts. Right? So technically, and again, but this also gives you extent of like the meaning of Jewish statelessness or what it was like before America was what it is today and before you had the state of Israel. Technically, he's still a Russian citizen. He's still a Russian subject. Right? Because the Ottomans were very iffy about giving Jews citizenship. So they're still Russian subjects. They're in Germany. Germany's in war with Russia. So Rav and Rebitz and Kook are officially enemy aliens. Right? Which also, it demonstrates the extent to which Jews were caught in the middle of these things. Right? So they avoid getting sent to an internment camp by the intervention of some local rabbis. They go to Switzerland, a town in Switzerland called St. Gallen. And they're there for about a year and a half. By the way, there's this one in the early days of the war. Maybe I already told you, there's a story. They're on a streetcar in Berlin, and they meet a young yeshiva student, and Rav Kook is very impressed with the guy, and they give them all of his money. And he says, I don't want it. And Rav Kook says, listen, I'm a well-known person. There's other Rabbanim who will take care of me. I'll be fine. You'll be very famous one day. But for now, nobody knows who you are, so take all of our money. And the young man's name was Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. Right? So
it's through the age.
It's through the age, yeah. So they go to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, so he's there for a year and a half. They're isolated, like communications between Europe and Eretz Yisrael are hard. There's no way to get back. Also, this is something that people often forget. World War I was the Holocaust was so overwhelming that it almost like can obscure the extent to which World War I was a colossal tragedy for the Jews. In Eretz Yisrael, there was massive starvation. The Jews were expelled from Tel Aviv. A lot of Jews were expelled from Yerushalayim. People were dying in the streets, and there was warfare. And most Dot were falling apart, and so forth. And then in America, we're very familiar with like all the images of the Western Front and the war in the trenches. But so much of World War I was taking place on the Eastern Front, right, between Germany and its allies in Russia. And so there, the Jewish communities are right in the middle of the war. And they're being devastated and destroyed by it. So it's a time of terrible suffering all around. He's in Switzerland. He's writing, ironically, when he's in Yaffo at times, he would write to people about how he was so busy and doesn't have time for himself and didn't have time for himself. And now Nebuch, he's stuck in Switzerland and he's like, has nothing but time for himself. And he's still writing a great deal. He writes a great deal. Because he's always writing his theological notebooks all long time. I mean, maybe next time when, they start getting published in the interwar years during the 1920s, that's when we'll talk about it more, but he's writing a very great deal. After a year and a half in Switzerland, he gets invited to London. In London, there's a community called Mirsky Hadass, and they are the East European Jewish community, the East European Jewish immigrant community of London in the East End, the poorer part of town. And he's asked to serve as their rabbi, and he goes there and he does. Because, in living in St. Gallen in Switzerland, and he was basically there, and he would go into Zurich once a week to give a Gemara shiur. And that's when it's in Switzerland that he really encounters like middle class bourgeois orthodoxy. And it's very not him, he's used to the Jewish life of Eastern Europe on the one hand, or like the very non-bourgeois, rebellious, let's write new Hebrew poetry thing of Eretz Yisrael, and the bourgeois Jewishness of the Swiss Jews, who he's very grateful to them for taking care of him, and he leaves a deep impression on them, etc. Is not. It's a slightly jarring encounter for him. Anyway, so in London, he's the rabbi of an Eastern European community. He's there by like December 1915 or so. And there he's like enjoys being a communal rabbi again. He's answering shilas. He has a shul. He has a community, has a congregation. He starts developing new groups of followers. A lot of the local intellectuals discover him and the Jewish socialists, as well as like the plain old Balabatim who he loves. And it's also for him the first time that he's living in a great European capital, right? He never lived in St. Petersburg. He never lived in Warsaw. He never lived out, and certainly not in France or Berlin. And so now he's in London. He describes in later years now he would like go to the art museums, and he was because also for him like part of the search for God in the world is aesthetics, right? Because also a crucial theological move of his, and one that he makes clear during his years in Yaffo, is like that the human drive for idealism, for the human search for justice and truth and beauty and community is how God speaks through the world, right? What's
the comment on Rembrandt?
There's a famous years later he gave a comment. He gave an interview, and we don't have it what he said in Hebrew or in Yiddish. It appeared only in English. And where is it? 1 second. I should, because I have it here.
Oh, here it is.
Yeah. So you want to read it?
Yeah, he said, he said, when I lived in London, I would visit the National Gallery, and my favorite pictures were those of Rembrandt. I really think that Rembrandt was a tzaddik. Do you know that when I first saw Rembrandt's works, they reminded me of the legend about the creation of light? We are told that when God created light, it was so strong and pellucid that one could see from one end of the world to the other, but God was afraid that the wicked might abuse it. What did he do? He reserved that light for the righteous men when the Messiah should come. But now and then there are great men who are blessed and privileged to see it. I think that Rembrandt was one of them. And the light in his pictures is the very light that was originally created by God Almighty. And this is... Rembrandt obviously was a Dutch painter, not Jewish. So in the 17th century, he's friends with Rabbi Menashe ben Israel and others.
Right. Yeah. So, but he sees but also he sees World War I as society, as Western civilization, committing suicide, right? It's like in one of the journals, he writes, the sin stains deep, right? Choshech yichas haaretz, the blood-spilling nations, wanton earthly kings make the earth shudder, right? Right? And the atonement must come, a general undoing of all the cultured nations of today. The spiritual and practical fabric that in its contemporary form could not stop, with all its wisdom, the great, great bloodshed and destruction of the world in this dreadful way has shown itself to be putrid at the root. So all the contemporary cultures will utterly be destroyed, and on their embers will be established a universal edifice in truth and the knowledge of God, right? Vayah Beis Hashem, right? Nisami Rosh Hagva'ot. Right? So it's interesting. During World War I, he writes extremely critically of Western civilization. He makes the point that when we talk about Galut HaShechina, when we talk about the Shechina being in exile, we don't mean some it sounds like a very beautiful, moving, tender metaphor. He says, look, it's a horror. The Shechina being in exile is this. It's rivers of blood. It's untold human suffering. It's all this catastrophe, right? And like many people, he's hoping that a better world will come of this. At one point, he writes, he publishes when he's in Europe, in London, in early 1917, a small book called Reish Milin, which is a series of meditations on the Aleph Beis. And it's in some ways his most obscure book. It's very hard to read. Obviously, letter mysticism is an important stream of the Kabbalah. But he says in the introduction, when the world makes no sense, when everything is collapsing, civilization is collapsing, there's violence and destruction everywhere, the only thing to do is return to the most basic of things, and that's the letters of the Aleph Beis with which God creates the world. And the letters of Aleph Beis are like that. The letters of Aleph Beis are sort of like the border, the crossing point between eternity and the present. And that's sort of like the way he's thinking about this. And then also he's writing about Eretz Yisrael. It's like, so on the one hand, during World War I, he writes the most far-reaching universalist things that he ever writes, right? That there's a real battle here, and the real battles between the well-intentioned people of humanity have to get together and stop all this terrible evil that we see, and hopefully the world will be a better place after the war, etc. And at the same time, he writes most passionately that he ever does about Eretz Yisrael, because he's consumed with longing for Eretz Yisrael. Because again, for him, Eretz Yisrael, it's not the platform for nation building. And it's not, it's not simply like that first mission, and not, or it's not just the pshat of that first mission in Kalim, right? That the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is how many mitzvahs you have to do there. But Eretz Yisrael is a vital spiritual presence, power in the world, and he feels deeply in exile from it. And then, boom, comes the Balfour Declaration, which seems to confirm his messianic reading of the time. So, as it is for many people, for Rav Kook, the Balfour Declaration is electrifying, right? I mean, it's not shocking that any number of people, certainly a traditional Jewish thinker might think, when you have a vast cataclysmic war, this might be Milchemes Gog uMagog, and this might be Pa'amei Mashiach, right? And especially when he thinks that history has sort of been going in that direction. And then you see that this horrible, horrible war has brought about the winning empire saying that there will be a Jewish national home there will be a national home for the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, right? And so, for many, many people, by the way, not just Rav Kook, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld reportedly said, let's say there was a cloudy day. Let's say that everything had been cloudy for a long, long time. A little bit of sunlight breaks through the clouds. You think, maybe there's some sunshine, right? So you didn't need to be Rav Kook to think that there was to be thrilled and moved by this, but he actually had a philosophy of history that perhaps helped explain this, right? That that like having destroyed itself, having committed a kind of suicide or purified itself of its own dross during World War I, now like the Jewish people would return to Eretz Yisrael and be able to like rebuild, to build like the new Jewish society that would be, of course, like, for the Jews, but also for the benefit of all the human race. And Rav Kook is not terribly involved in lobbying around Balfour because he's not that kind of person. There's a fascinating exchange. Chaim Weizmann, who mentions the first president of the state of Israel and is the great diplomat, statesman, architect of the Balfour Declaration, his lieutenant, Nachum Sokolov, he dispatches him to talk to Rav Kook. He said I read the letters. He says, I understand Rabbi Kook is in London. Go and talk to him, see if you can get him involved in the work. And, and it doesn't really, Rav Kook was not a man for like political lobbying and that kind of diplomacy at the time. He and Sokolov, they spend most of the time talking about, Spinoza and the Zohar. And Sokolov reports back to Chaim Weizmann, he's a very great man, but he's not somebody that you can like put him in a room with like a cabinet minister and start negotiating. Although Rav Kook does write some letters on behalf of the agitation towards the Balfour Declaration that do make some waves. But he has several responses to the Balfour Declaration. One is he starts writing a Siddur commentary called Olat Re'iyah, and it's basically this very ecstatic Siddur commentary. He writes that he sort of starts petering out around Ashrei, and eventually, when it's published by his son Yehudah, the rest is filled out with works from elsewhere, especially from his commentary to Masechet Brachot Ein Hayad, the Agadah to Masechet Brachot. But also, he has an idea for a new movement of his own to be called Degel Yerushalayim, because also he had always been dissatisfied with the Mizrahi, and his dissatisfaction with the Mizrahi was the Mizrahi's willingness to sort of accept a second-tier status within the Zionist movement, but also very much that, remember, like Zionism, the Zionism was a political movement, but it was also a cultural movement, and of course, the Mizrahi was not terribly interested in promoting the secular culture that many Zionists wanted to do. And so, like, their working arrangement with the Zionist movement as a whole was that, we're just going to focus mainly on the political stuff. And, like, we're not going to make cultural and spiritual revival a big part of the Zionist movement, because that's, so to speak, playing with fire. And Rav Kook actually thought that spiritual and cultural revival was the heart of what Zionism should be doing. And it was the heart of what religious Jews should be doing by participating alongside the Zionist movement. And so he decides to create this movement called Degel Yerushalayim that will work alongside the Zionist movement and provide the spiritual revival element of Zionism. And this is when he lays out his plans for things like the yeshiva and a revised kind of Torah literature, and sort of making spiritual revival central to Zionism, and bringing together religious and secular, and doing this in all kinds of ways. Now, he does this in a vacuum, right? He's not connected to the people who are actually, working in the parties in the Zionist movement. The Zionists, they tend not to like this. They think, where are you coming from, Vaskumt, that you're creating your own party here. You keep saying, I'm not creating a party, I just want to create institutions. So there's like, as not infrequently with Rav Kook, his greatness in theology and in human relations and in learning is not necessarily matched by, obvious sort of political maneuvering and organization building in that kind of way. So as a movement, Degel Yerushalayim doesn't really go anywhere, but it serves for him to clarify in his head a blueprint of things to do, ways, institutions, and how maybe to build a Zionist a parallel religious track of national renewal and rebirth alongside Zionism. Now, what's been going on in Eretz Yisrael? So during the war in Eretz Yisrael, institutions fall apart. Owing to the Balfour Declaration, right, there's all sorts of different groups in Eretz Yisrael, and not all of them are Zionist. Of course, you have the old Yishuv. You also have the the people under the banner of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, who are sort of like the Francophone Jews, who are like, some of them are Zionists, but some of them are anti or just non-Zionist. But by the end of World War I, because of Balfour and because of the Zionist association with Balfour, with the British, then the Zionists are clearly in charge now in Eretz Yisrael. And people need to start dealing with them. And now Rav Kook, at this point, by the end of World War I, for many people, he has become the indispensable man. Because of his distinctiveness, because he's unlike most everyone else. So on the one hand, the Zionists understand that now that they are stepped out onto the world stage, they need somebody who will, they need like a rabbinic figure to sort of represent rabbinic tradition, right? Also, they have ideas about creating institutions, creating religious institutions. And so Zionists generally, they want some sort of achiza, some sort of foothold, some sort of like in like traditional Jewry as a whole, right? There are the rabbis who the Orthodox or traditionalist rabbis who want to cooperate with Zionism. They need somebody with big shoulders to protect them, right? They need a person of undoubted, stature in learning and in tzidkus and in moral authority, etc., to say, yes, this is okay. This is how we're cooperating with the Zionists. And also these are the limits that we're going to set, right? So they need that. And it turns out that not only it's just in terms of his personal qualities, but it turns out he actually has a full-blown philosophy of history for how Dafka, the secular Zionist revolution, can fit into the broader fabric of Jewish history as whole towards the ultimate end of Geula. And so so they all kind of need him, and he senses that it's time for him to move from Yaffo to Jerusalem, to Yerushalayim. And eventually he returns in 1919, a few months after the end of the war, to Yerushalayim, to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, to become the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi of Yerushalayim. And it's 2 years after, that we'll talk about next time, that he becomes the first Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi.
Right. So I think this episode is a very important part of his life. And, we'll next episode, we'll focus on, as you said, once he moves to Yerushalayim and his move there, there's the infamous comments he makes at the founding of the university.
But even before that, already starting in like 1920 with the publication of the book Orot, so the sheer spiritual dynamism and of his journals is going to start getting published and come to public notice. So, and people start taking the measure of Rav Kook as a thinker, and, some, will be very enthused and others will have a very different sort of response.
No, I just wanted to tease it. Obviously, there'll be the rest of his life, and what happens, the founding of Merkaz Arav, and you said Hebrew, publication of all his Sfarim. There's going to be the Kaisel, the riots of 1929, the Arlo Sorov affair. There's all his students, there's friends,
and a big drama of this deeply conciliatory personality with this very conciliatory theology being put in the middle of what's going to be an extremely conflictual situation.
Yes, and then there'll be his funeral, and then we'll get to his impact and his legacy today, and that's an important part as well to discuss.
Yes.
Obviously, I think for those that claim him and those that don't like him,
as recently as like last Shabbos, like you open up the newspapers and like what is the true legacy of Rav Kook and what did he think or didn't think or whatever is still a very, very live issue with very practical consequences.
Yeah. So we'll go there. We'll get to that episode. And so with that, this is the end of episode 2. So hope everyone enjoyed. And thank you, Professor Mirsky, for joining me once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Really appreciate it.